All right. What up, what up, what up? How's everybody doing? How's it going? We are continuing with, all right, we got Allison in for 1,000 Lancelot. You're the first one up. We are continuing with the review of the video called The Bankruptcy of Moral Relativism. This is part 2. I did part 1 a couple days ago. It's Greg Koukl. I think that's how you say his name. So the first 15 minutes we reviewed in the previous episode was him laying out the kind of metaethical landscape. Just as a recap, I think he got a lot of the distinctions right. He did a good job clarifying a few things. I think he made some mistakes there. There was one case where it looked to me like he was making a mistake. I think there's some lack of clarity in his part, and I realized that a minute or two into that, and I went back and corrected for that. And so one of the things that he clarified is that sensitivity to context. If you think, hey, stealing would be wrong to steal because you're greedy, but it wouldn't be wrong to say to steal a loaf of bread to feed your starving family. That's not a specific example he gave, but anybody that draws that distinction where they think it's okay to steal in some cases and not in others, that doesn't make you a relativist. That doesn't make you a moral anti-realist. That is entirely consistent with moral realism. Being concerned with whether a category of action is permissible in some instances and not others, depending on differences in those circumstances, does not entail any particular metaethical stance. So that was a point he clarified. But other than that, all he really did was lay the groundwork for what kinds of terms, concepts, and distinctions that he's going to work with. And where we stopped was a good point to stop, because right after that, he gets into, or he's going to get into, what he takes to be wrong with moral relativism. So we're going to get into that. Clashman the Third, you come in for 500 Lancelot, and then Jack S for 250. So this is about where we were. It's a few seconds before, just so we could ease into the video a bit, make sure the volume is good. Yep. Okay, we should be good to go. I am not going to give you a super long preamble. We're just going to get right into it. I'll save announcements and anything else for the end of the video. Let's get into it.
Opinion about it, and they do whatever they want. Again, relativism is subject dependent and objectivism is object dependent. Relativism is mind independent. Objectivism is mind dependent. Okay, with that clear.
So one quick thing on that, because this is where we ended at the last video. Notice that he said relativism is subject dependent. Now, a few points of clarification regarding terminology. This is a pretty conventional way to use this kind of terminology. And let me just make sure he definitely said relativism and not
clarification is subject. Relativism is when the circumstances are the same for everybody, but everybody has a different moral opinion about it, and they do whatever they want. Again, relativism is subject.
Yeah, relativism.
Dependent.
Subject dependent. So remember, we have a difference, and this is a difference that Richard Joyce goes through pains to emphasize in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, between two distinctions. One distinction is whether moral claims are made true by stances or they're not made true by stances. That's the stance dependence versus the stance independence distinction. Then you have a second one, which has to do with truth claims, like moral truth claims, whether those claims are indexed or not indexed. If they're indexed, then it is similar to saying something like, that's a shoe. You know, the word that is a shoe. The word that serves as an indexical. If I point to an object that's a shoe and I say that is a shoe, the statement is true. If I point to an object that's not a shoe and I say that is a shoe, the statement is false. And so the word that varies depending on what I'm pointing to or what I'm referring to. And then you have words like I or you. If I say I am Lance, if I'm saying it, the statement is true because I am. If someone that's not Lance says I am Lance, the statement is false. So relativism, at least one way of using the term, is to refer to this indexicalization feature that could potentially apply to moral claims. And typically the view would be that they're implicit. People don't tend to go around saying stealing is wrong according to my standards. They'll just say stealing is wrong, and then it's implicit stealing is wrong according to their standards. Now, there are two separate distinctions. There's nothing necessarily wrong with using the term relativism to refer to stance dependence, but typically, I can't even say typically. I don't know that anybody uses any particular term to refer to stance dependence other than stance dependence. Sometimes people will use the term subjectivism. Humer uses the term subjectivism to refer to stance-dependent cognitivist accounts. in his book, Ethical Intuitionism. But I mean, he also uses the term observer independent instead of stance independent. So he has somewhat idiosyncratic usage in other ways. So there just isn't any standardized terminology. I would not critique Greg for using like the incorrect term. He's not doing that because there isn't any standardized use of these terms. Unfortunately, the terms are used to refer to both of the distinctions. So, and then different, so sometimes you would use different terms to refer to the same distinction and the same term to refer to different distinctions. And so it is an absolute mess. We just don't have consistent use of terminology. And that's very unfortunate. He is drawing an absolutely legitimate distinction here. And that's fine. I think what he's targeting appears to be views that hold that moral standards depend on, like moral truths depend on people's standards, attitudes, values, something like that. So it looks like he's critiquing stance dependent accounts. Now, it's not clear whether he is aware of or is intending to draw this distinction between indexicalization and stance dependence. Maybe he's not. And also, if we're going to be honest, in practice, it doesn't matter that much. There are some nuances to this that might matter if we get into some of the minutia, but for the most part, it looks like he's targeting the kind of convergence of relativism and stance dependence. So this would be views where moral facts are made true by stances, and specifically the stances of individuals. And this would lead to truth claims varying depending on which individuals are making those truth claims. It doesn't seem like he's drawing any distinction between agent and appraiser relativism either. And it also doesn't seem like he's drawing a distinction between cultural relativism and individual relativism and other potential forms of relativism. It's not like your only conceptually possible options are relativizing to cultures or relativizing to individuals. You could relativize to society, you could relativize to nations, which isn't identical to culture. You could relativize to broad, transnational communities if you wanted to. You could relativize to species. In principle, you could relativize to a solar system. You could relativize to any community group or organ. You could relativize to religions. What if somebody said that moral facts apply to you based on which religion you follow? You could relativize to something other than cultures in principle, but nobody ever talks about that for whatever reason. They just never do. Now, is he making a mistake by not drawing all these distinctions? No, I don't think so, because 15 minutes, he's already spent a lot of time, more than almost anybody would, clarifying and drawing out the distinctions. And I think he does a better job than, I see quite a lot of people do. So that's already a lot of time. That might even be too much time. So to get into all these nuances and distinctions, nobody would follow it. It would end up just being like a kind of pedantic university lecture that would be unfathomably boring for almost everybody. Nobody would be following along. It would be strategically a very bad idea to get into all the nuances. So as far as a kind of so does that mean he's not aware of these distinctions? No, it's a simplification. This is a very reasonable way to approach what I presume is the kind of audience he's dealing with. If anything, this is actually like he's actually using quite sophisticated terminology, like he uses mind dependence at some point. Now you'll know that what he does is he intersperses some of this technical talk that he's using with anecdotes, with stories, and with humor. I don't do a whole lot of that. It's very effective. It gives people a kind of cognitive break from the technical stuff. So overall, in terms of delivery, this is far better than what I almost ever see from anybody. And, I'm almost at pains to say that because I'm going to critique what he has to say about relativism. Obviously, I don't agree with his worldview on the matter, but he's doing a good job. So you gotta give someone credit where that's due. Now that, again, you could watch your previous video. I've said plenty of critical things. One of them was I don't think the others are mistakes. So I do think he's making some errors here, and this could be improved. But I made a mistake in my video. So, you don't throw somebody under the bus or say that, what someone has to say is useless because they make mistakes. The important thing is to recognize, acknowledge, and correct for them. Now we are going to get into some of the critiques, but, overall, it's just that as I'm watching this, I'm actually like, hey, compared to a lot of the stuff I've seen, not too bad. All right, let's see. We got Ducks Y in the comments. I don't know if have you been in here in my streams before, or are you new? If you're new, welcome. If you've been here for a while, sorry, I forgot about you. Maybe you change your profile picture or something. Does he mean moral relativism? Yes, he's talking about moral relativism. And you can see that in the title of the video, which is on the screen. So Juxoy says, I just looked up, bro. He doesn't understand the English vernacular or linguistic distinctions. I'm not quite sure what you're talking about.
And objectivism is object dependent. Relativism is mind independent. Objectivism is mind dependent. Okay, with
yeah, did he say object dependent? That sounds a little strange, but that's fine. We could skip over some of the terminology problems that there might be there.
That clarification. Now that I've cleared up that confusion, right?
And this is where we were at previously.
It is a tough challenge. Let's talk a little bit about the problems with moral relativism proper. What I'd like to do with the rest of our time together is I want to expose the myth of moral neutrality. The suggestion that morality is just up to everybody. We're all neutral with regards to others. Tolerance is our kind of guiding principle in that. I want to show the myth of moral neutrality. There is no such thing. And therefore, if tolerance is based on moral neutrality, and neutrality is a myth, then tolerance, the way it's being exercised in our culture, is also a myth. I want to show you how to answer the charge of intolerance kind of in a tactical way in a conversation. And then I'm going to give you some arguments against relativism. Moral relativism is false, and there are very good reasons to believe it's false.
Now, note that his characterization of moral relativism up to this point appears to be, it's not 100% clear, but it looks like it's either specifically the view that moral facts depend on the standards of individuals, or there could be a conjunction of that in some type of indexicalization of the truth of moral claims. But at the very least, it looks like he's taking it to be stance dependence and specifically the stances of individuals. And so that would give you some type of individual relativism. Now, when it comes to that position, that would be a type of anti-realism because there's stance dependence. And then it would be, presumably genuinely a type of relativism because there would be variation in the truth of moral claims depending on who's making the claims. Now, that doesn't tell us, maybe he could finesse this a bit by adding in something about cultural relativism, and the moral facts could be made true by the standards of cultures rather than individuals. But what's going to be critical here are two things. One is whether he's going to draw the agent and appraiser relativism distinction. We've been over that many times. I don't want to go over it again unless somebody in chat really needs me to. And two, the distinction between the various types of what I guess you could call pseudo-relativism or non-metaethical relativism. Now, metaethical relativism, what he's described so far, has, right up until what he's saying here, has only sounded like a metaethical position. Now, what is metaethics? Well, it's a branch of philosophy, and in particular, a branch of moral philosophy that deals with abstract questions about the fundamental nature of morality. So questions like, is there such thing as moral truth? If so, what is the nature of moral truth? How can we acquire knowledge of the moral truth? Are we necessarily motivated by our belief in that something is morally right or wrong? So there are a variety of questions that span most of the rest of philosophy, in epistemology, in metaphysics, and philosophy of language, that are all fall within the scope of metaethics. So metaethics has its tendrils in every other area of philosophy, but it's still metaethics. It deals with these sort of second order questions about morality, these abstract questions. Now, there are also two other senses in which people will on occasion use the term relativism, or they will treat relativism as a kind of package deal that carries other characteristics alongside whatever metaethical position one takes. So if one takes a position as a metaethical relativist, and in particular, they hinge moral truth on the standards of individuals, then they are a stance-dependent cognitivist. What that means is they take moral claims to be capable of being true or false, and what makes them true are the standards of, or the stances of individuals. And then that would make moral truth claims as true or false relative to which individual is making the. Now, that could be relativized to the agent, and that gives you a type of agent relativism, or they could be relativized to the appraiser, which gives you appraiser relativism. So there are additional distinctions here. These positions, depending on which one of those, which is why it's sort of downstream, this potential conflation with like what we could call non-metaethical relativism, or if we want to be a little more derogatory, like pseudo-relativism. Now, if you're yeah, I guess I have to talk about this distinction. If you're an appraiser relativist, you basically treat moral claims as a kind of implicit descriptive claim where you're reporting what your standards are. So, if you say something like stealing is wrong, you're saying, I disapprove of stealing. I mean, it's like a psychological fact about you. It's kind of trivial truth. It doesn't really have any normative implications. It doesn't really have any, substantive practical implications for other people, other than that you're providing information about your attitudes or your standards or your disposition to act in a particular way. I mean, potentially, it could be that someone could say, I disapprove of stealing, but I have no interest in stopping and I want to sit here and watch TV. So it may not even have practical implications, but it has at least some descriptive implications because it's telling you something about the psychology of the person making the report. Now, that's appraiser relativism. But agent relativism holds that moral truth claims are judged. I didn't even say exactly what it was. It holds that moral truth claims are judged as true or false relative to the standards of whoever is making the moral evaluation. So if you're judging something as right or wrong, you are the judge, and the person making the claim, the person making the evaluation, and you could judge other people's actions. You could judge the actions of other individuals, other cultures, whatever. And so you judge everybody by your own standards. So this would not entail that you must tolerate other people. So if you're against stealing and someone's trying to steal, you could stop them. Why? Because you judge things according to your standards. This is in contrast to agent relativism, which holds that whether an action is right or wrong depends on the standards of the agent performing the action. If we're talking about cultural agent relativism, it's the standards of the culture of the agent performing the action. Now, that view arguably carries normative implications, because what it would mean is that if someone else or some other culture thinks it's okay for them to steal or lie or kill or whatever, then their standards actually fix the facts about what it's okay for that person to do in a way that arguably has some implications for you. It would be good for that person to steal, or at least permissible for that person to steal, in a way that you have some compulsion under penalty of like rejecting what's morally good or bad or permissible or whatever, the goodness or badness of their action. So in other words, if someone else thinks it's okay to steal, it is in fact okay for that person to steal, and you would have an obligation to agree it's good for that person to steal. So now if you try to stop them, you'd be potentially doing something wrong. Now, there are issues with this. So what if you think you have an obligation to stop anyone who tries to steal from stealing, and they think they have an obligation to steal? Well, what do you act on? Because you have your standards and they have their standards, and they're in conflict with one another. What do you do? Because you're bound by your own standards and you're bound by their standards. Now what? I don't know how agent relativists are supposed to resolve those sorts of issues. And that might expose some internal inconsistencies or problems with the view. It might need, look, weirder views have survived like superficial, passes at attempting to expose contradictions or internal problems. So someone could finesse this, they could nuance this, they could add caveats and qualifications and ways that get around this potential conflict. But the bottom line is, at least at first glance, agent relativism does seem to have implications where you would have to abstain potentially from interfering when other people perform actions that you may personally regard as repugnant and horrible. And when people critique relativism, they almost always focus on this latter form, agent relativism, which might look just like a metaethical position, but it bleeds into the practical and the normative in ways that make it a kind of hybrid position that traverses both metaethics and normative ethics. So, and it might even go into applied ethics, because you could think of like specific instances. What should I do in this particular case, given that I have this standard and they have that standard? Or what should you do if two people are fighting and they have different moral standards? Maybe that's not applied enough or specific enough. Maybe that's, I don't know if there's any sharp distinction between applied ethics and normative ethics. But it's going to spill over outside of being, quote unquote, pure metaethics. So that's already a problem for the view. But what I take issue with is the fact that almost every time that I've seen almost every time I've seen critics criticize relativism, they only focus on agent relativism, and they don't bring up or seem to be aware of appraiser relativism. And they don't say, hey, I'm going to critique agent relativism. They just say relativism without qualification. This would be a bit like if, I targeted a particular denomination of Christians and then said, well, Christians are wrong because they believe in Imagine if I said Christians are wrong because, and then I pick like they believe like Calvinism or something like that. A lot of Christians would naturally react by saying, but I'm not a Calvinist. So that doesn't apply to me. And I'm like, yeah, Christians think this, Christians believe that. And then other, non-Calvinists would go, what the hell are you talking about? I don't think that. And then I just ignore them and go, and Christians think this and Christians think that. And they could rightly object by saying, you're only targeting one specific form of Christianity. Why aren't you? Well, and presenting it as if you're targeting all of it. That doesn't make any sense. And it's the same thing when people critique agent relativism, critique it as if they're critiquing all of relativism. They're not. So that becomes a downstream problem because of, I mean, it's loosely related to one of these and it's more closely related to another. Is you have these two types of pseudo-relativism. One you could call descriptive relativism. And I think the moral relativism entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy mentions these. Descriptive relativism is the simple, you could say empirical or descriptive observation that different people have different moral standards. Now, that could be very deceptive. People can have different moral standards. People can have different positions on what's morally right or wrong in a particular case because they have differences in non-moral belief. So classical case would be one group of people thinks you need to engage in human sacrifice. Another group of people thinks this is a repugnant, horrible. Well, why do they disagree? Well, one group thinks you have to appease the bloodthirsty gods and the other doesn't believe in those gods. So they think you're wasting your time. Now, if you could convince the first group that there are no bloodthirsty gods that need human sacrifice to not destroy the world, then they might go, oh no, let's stop human sacrifice. Whereas if you convince the other group that if they don't do human sacrifice too, the world will end or whatever, then they would get on board. So they actually share the same more fundamental moral principles, which is that a certain degree of sacrifice would be morally permissible to prevent a much greater harm. So they might both have a consequentialist rationale here, and they just disagree on the non-moral facts. The non-moral fact here being, is there a bloodthirsty God that's demanding human sacrifice under penalty of global destruction or something, or world destroying the universe or whatever it would be? So that's not what this is about. This would be about the observation that people have what you could call fundamental differences in value. They genuinely have different normative moral standards. It's not just due to a difference in non-moral beliefs. So this would be, for instance, somebody that thinks all moral truth is reducible to facts about happiness and suffering. And then someone else says, no, it's not reducible to that. I'm a deontologist and there's moral rules you should follow independent of their impact on happiness and suffering. It doesn't mean they don't care about happiness and suffering, but they're not exclusively concerned with that. They're concerned with conformity to certain sorts of rules, like, you shouldn't commit adultery or whatever. So that would be an instance of descriptive relativism. And it's simply the fact that different people have different standards. Now, that's not a metaethical position. That's like an empirical position about human psychology or the psychology of individuals. They don't have to be humans. It could be elves and dwarves or something, from Lord of the Rings. That's descriptive relativism. That's one kind of pseudo-relativism. That's the one that's not really that closely related to this. Then you have the other type of relativism, which is normative relativism. Again, pseudo-relativism. This is the view that you ought to tolerate people with different moral standards than you, and you ought not intervene or try to impose your standards on them. Now, if you're an agent relativist, you may endorse a view like that. It's a little weird because is it a non-relative moral rule that you have to do so, or is it not? Like, why are you following this rule? There are ways of getting around this. You could think as a matter of practical rationality, it would be irrational to impose your standards on somebody if what they're doing isn't wrong. So there might be some method of saying that you're not following a stance independent moral rule if you do this, but that there would be some other type of mistake or error that you're making. At the very least, you could say that you shouldn't on moral grounds relative to your own standards, arguably. But it gets a little weird. So like the issue here, and what makes this weird, and is why I call this a la carte realism, is that let's say there's two people in the world, right? And one of them has the standard that you shouldn't steal, and one has the standard that you should steal, or that at least that it's permissible to steal. Well, if the one that's against stealing is objecting to the other one stealing, one moment. Oh, okay. 1 second. I have to deal with something. Okay. I think it's the question of whether my wife is home or not. And I might have to talk to her for a second. Alrighty. So where was I at? Right. Okay. So you have the two people and they have these different standards. Now, where was I at with this? Oh man, I'm trying to remember where I was at. Oh, right. so you have the question of like, okay, if it's permissible for the other person to steal, then it would be like, it would be morally bad to stop them from stealing. It would be morally good to allow them to steal. And so, what's interesting about this, and the reason I call this a la carte realism, is that the fact that it would be permissible for that person, the fact that it would be wrong to try to stop them from stealing would be true independent of your own standards. And so you still get something realist like on agent relativism, which is that there are going to be facts about what you should or shouldn't do that apparently are binding on you and have some type of normative authority over you that are true independent of your own goals, standards, or values. So one of the things that's funny about people criticizing relativism is they'll say stuff like, oh, well, a relativist just thinks that you should do whatever you want, nothing matters, blah blah blah. And then they'll talk about how relativists have these standards, like they have to favor tolerance, they have to respect other people's values, they can't impose their standards on other people. Well, if you mean that those are normative standards, they don't have to endorse those as normative standards like directly, like they personally hold those as personal values. Those obligations would be binding them independent of their own attitudes, preferences, or values, just like realism. And so if what's objectionable about a person not stopping the bad people, like World War II bad people, is that as a relativist you would be prohibited from condemning their actions or regarding them as wrong. Well, why is that? Well, it's because the agent relativist would be committed to thinking that their own culture or the standards of those individuals fixes the moral facts for them in a way that creates binding, normatively authoritative rules that they're obliged to follow, independent of their own preferences and values. They don't have to prefer have preferences in line with those other people. The whole point is that what's so objectionable about this is that you would be compelled to, or morally obliged to, not intervene, to not stop them from, committing genocide or torturing people or whatever, in spite of the fact that it's not in accord with your values. That's actually kind of realist like. And so it's a little weird to say the view is objectionable because everything is up to you and you just do whatever you want, and that what's objectionable about it is that you'd be obliged to not do what you want, to not act on your personal values, goals, and interests, and that you'd actually have to respect people from other cultures and values, even if they were doing things you disapproved of. Which is it? So a lot of times critics seem to vacillate between the kinds of criticisms that you would level against appraiser relativists, which is that your standards are arbitrary, you just do whatever you want, blah, blah, blah. And the critiques you would level against, did I say appraiser? Yeah, well, that would be appraiser relativism. And then the critiques against agent relativism, which don't do that. So which is it? So people are not being clear in their criticisms, and they often make criticisms, maybe they're spread out. I don't have an example of somebody doing this in real time. But it's weird that you get the general tenor that people will make both of these types of critiques when they're inconsistent with each other. That's not how that works. So I don't think critics of relativism are properly distinguishing the different types of relativism because their objections often conflict with one another and don't make a whole lot of sense. And ironically, some of those objections are objections to the realist-like qualities of certain types of relativism, namely, in this case, agent relativism. So you have those problems. And then on top of that, you will have people, which is what Greg is doing here, that collapse the distinction between metaethical relativism, and he's already collapsing the distinction between relativism and stance dependence. But then in addition to that, it's not that big of a deal because almost everybody that's a relativist is going to be a relativist with respect to stances. So not that big of a deal, but it is technically the collapse of a distinction. But now he's describing relativism with the stuff about tolerance, and these like other sorts of characteristics and features, which is what I think I call this in my discussions with Derek McAllister, folk relativism. So there's these folk relativist views that it's not metaethical relativism. So note at the beginning of the video, he lays out all these clear conceptual distinctions in metaethics. I mean, not perfectly clear, but clear enough. And it looks like he's talking about the academic philosophical concept of metaethical relativism. And then as soon as he shifts into his critique, that seems to be going away. And now we're dealing with folk relativism, which is this amalgamation of muddled views, not just about metaethics, but about descriptive ethics and normative ethics and all these other sorts of things. Now, some of those may be extensions of or implications due to agent relativism, but they're not for appraiser relativism unless he's going to make critiques of both and not draw the distinction. So he's already setting things up in a way where he's pivoting from the position as an academic position to the folk relativist position. And that's really unfortunate because the folk relativist position can be an internally inconsistent, incoherent mess that I would agree with moral realists about is this incoherent mess that has practically horrible consequences. So if you have groups of people that are in the state of like practical malaise, they're unwilling to intervene to stop a genocide, or they're unwilling to condemn the actions of people in other places. So there's places where people are oppressed or mistreated. And they go, well, they do their thing, I do mine. Who am I to judge? I think that's a horrible view to have. It's an awful, awful view. And I'm opposed to it. I'm opposed to it on normative grounds, though. I'm not opposed to it because I think that they have like the wrong metaethics. I don't care what their metaethics are. I don't want people to not care if other people are suffering or being horribly mistreated. So you have this problem, which is that people are not being clear on, are they critiquing a specific metaethical position? And if so, which specific ones are they criticizing? Or are they criticizing folk relativism? In other words, so in this case, I should just say what folk relativism is. Folk relativism is, as a matter of descriptive fact, the rough set of views of people who self-identify as moral relativists or who employ the language, behavior, dispositions, and attitudes that one might commonly associate with a sort of broad endorsement of moral relativism among some subset of the public. It's maybe not the best definition. I was making it up as I go, but that's not necessarily, and in practice, I don't think that it is, metaethical relativism understood as a very refined and specific philosophical position. So the moment you start talking about tolerance, it's no longer clear. Are you talking about agent or appraiser relativism? Are you talking about descriptive or normative relativism? What are you talking about exactly? Because even if you could show that like folk relativism is a muddled mess of confusion and nonsense, that wouldn't show that any particular metaethical position is false. For the same reason, if I could find like let's say I go to some church where they don't really read the Bible that much, they're not very theologically sophisticated, and I exposed all these inconsistencies and misunderstandings in their views. They didn't know how to explain the Trinity. They didn't know how to explain transubstantiation. They didn't know about the nature of the divinity of Jesus, and they wouldn't be able to explain it if they tried. Would that show that Christianity is nonsensical and false? No, it would show that those people don't know what they're talking about. Christian theologians might have answers to all of those questions. Now, maybe they wouldn't, but that's not the point. I'm not saying Christianity is true. I'm saying the fact that you could find groups of people in the public that do not understand Christian doctrine and are confused about it does not show that Christianity is false. It shows those people don't understand the doctrine. That's all it shows. Likewise, if you could find people out like in the street where you find random undergraduates that call themselves relativists, and then when you examine their views, it's an incoherent mess, that does not show that relativism is an incoherent mess. It doesn't show it's false. It doesn't show it's a bad idea. And so what really concerns me with the kinds of critiques he's leveling here is that it's not one of the unclear cases where someone just like, lots of people believe in relativism, here's what's wrong with it. And then it looks like you could give them a pass and saying, yeah, okay, they're critiquing folk relativism. Here, the context of what he's setting up makes it look like he's criticizing a metaethical position. And then he pivots into what looks like it's probably going to be folk relativism. But let's see.
Objective moral principles that apply to everybody.
That was a while, so I'm going to take it back a little bit.
Some arguments against relativism. Moral relativism is false, and there are very good reasons to believe it's false. There are objective moral principles that apply to everybody. And then I'm going to show you, I'll close with, how does this all fit in with Jesus? Because it's very closely related. And incidentally, if you think about it, if moral relativism is true, this is really bad news for Christianity. Because in Christianity, we believe in Jesus. Jesus is our what? Starts with an S. Savior, right. Okay, he saves us from something, right? Also starts with an S. Sin, right? What is sin? Sin is when you violate an objective moral principle. You do bad.
So I don't know what he's basing this on. Sin is when you violate an objective moral principle. I've never seen any scriptural basis for saying that violating sins is the violation of objective moral principles. So this is why it's important to distinguish relativism as indexing because that allows for there to be different standards of moral truth, and relativism as stance dependence, which doesn't necessarily allow for there to be different standards of moral truth. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that moral facts could be true dependent on a stance, but what if they were all dependent on God's stance? Well, then there's only one set of moral truths. And arguably, they're not even particularly arbitrary. They wouldn't be contingent because they'd be necessary moral truths, but they would still be dependent on God's stance. That gives you a type of anti-realism when we understand anti-realism to be the view that there's no stance-independent moral facts. If all moral facts depend on God's stance, there are no stance-independent moral facts. Therefore, you have moral anti-realism. Now, some people, William Lane Craig being one of them, has made some remarks where it appears he wants to work around that. And he's like, well, yeah, but that's not what was objectionable about relativism is the arbitrariness and the contingency of it. Okay, fine. Then object to relativism on those grounds. But it doesn't make sense to object to relativism on the grounds of stance dependence. I mean, assuming we're dealing with a stance dependent type of relativism, because again, there is a distinction there. So too bad. That's not what the view is. So objecting to views that hold that moral facts are stance dependent, a view which says, hey, moral facts are stance dependent. And we're going to use the label anti-realist to refer to views that hold that moral facts are stance dependent. It's a little weird to object to this by saying, yeah, but that's not what I find objectionable, the stance dependence. I object to the contingency and arbitrariness. Okay, then object to those. But if you think moral facts are stance dependent, you're still an anti-realist. Too bad. That's just how people have opted to use the terminology, and carving out special exceptions because you want to gerrymander terminology because you don't like the sound of the word anti-realism is silly. It's silly. Just accept that you're an anti-realist and that you object to other anti-realist positions. At least that would be my advice. But people can argue about how they want to use this terminology if they want to. But there's a difference between, hey, I think we should use the term this way, and hey, I'm not an anti-realist, even though I think all the moral facts are stance dependent. Nah. If the term means there are no stance independent moral facts, and that's what you think, you're an anti-realist as per that definition. It'd be a bit weird, like saying, hey, I want to be a bachelor even though I'm married, and so I'm just going to redefine bachelor to be anybody that's an unmarried man or me personally. Like that, nope, no, that's not how that works. But again, you could stipulate you're going to use the word that way, but then you're just using the word in a way that's different from the way everybody else is using the word, and that's the kind of verbal gerrymandering that I find really objectionable. I don't think people should do philosophy in that way, and it looks to me like William Lane Craig does precisely that. Danny sent me an excerpt from his exchanges with Michael Huemer where that appears to be exactly what he's doing. I have it somewhere. I'm not going to pull it up now. This idea, it's important to pull out this idea of relativism and this idea of stance dependence because, relativism might not work with, a God-based morality because it would allow there to be standards other than God's standard. And you might not want that. I don't know if it's necessarily logically inconsistent. So you want to get rid of the relativism as indexing or allowing for variation in what the moral truths are. But you don't have to get rid of the stance dependence as far as I could tell. I've seen nothing in the Bible and I've seen nothing about Christian doctrine that would rule out the consistency between stance dependence of moral truth and theism. Now, maybe there's something, but I haven't seen it in the Bible, and I haven't seen anything convincing from Christians about this, like that Christianity requires moral realism. I do have a video discussing this with a Christian, David Pullman, so you can check that out. I don't remember where it is, so if someone throws a link in the chat, I'll pin it. But I've had, that's at least one person that is not a moral realist and is a Christian. He calls himself a moral skeptic. So as far as I understand it, he's agnostic on the realism, anti-realism question. So he's not an anti-realist, but not a realist. So yeah, this idea that sin has to be objective. I've never seen any scriptural basis for this. I don't know of any compelling basis. He's just asserting this. I don't know that there's any legitimate case to be made for this.
But what if there are no objective moral principles? Well, then there can't be any sin. And if there's no sin, then there's no need for a savior. And if there's no need for a savior, there's no need for Jesus, at least not the kind of Jesus we're talking about. Not the insulin kind of Jesus. You can have your ice cream kind of Jesus, fine. But our Jesus is dead in the water, if moral relativism is true. Okay. Now, sometimes relativism can be expressed in fairly sophisticated ways. So I'm going to read something to you that was written by Waddton. Some of you might remember the name. She used to be the president of Planned Parenthood. Now, you might imagine that I would disagree with her on a lot of things, which is true. But I'm reading this not to ridicule at all, because she's written a piece on moral relativism that I think is very, very compelling, at least at first glance. She's very articulate and very persuasive. In fact, when I read this to you, many of you are going to think, wow, that's pretty persuasive. I'm supposed to probably disagree with her, but I don't know how I can disagree with her without sounding foolish. All right. But there's a flaw here. And we'll talk about that, and you might catch on to it as I read. So here I go. Waddton. Like most parents, I think that a sense of moral responsibility is one of the greatest gifts I can give my child. But teaching morality doesn't mean imposing my moral values on others. It means sharing wisdom, giving reasons for believing as I do, and then trusting others to think and judge for themselves. My parents' morals were deeply rooted in religious conviction, but tempered by tolerance. There's our word. The essence of which is respect for other people's views. They taught me that reasonable people may differ on moral issues, and that fundamental respect for others is morality of the highest order. I devoted my career to ensuring a world in which my daughter, Felicia, can inherit that legacy. I hope the tolerance and respect I show her as a parent is reinforced by the work she sees me doing every day, fighting for the right of all individuals to make their own moral decisions about childbearing. Of course, we're talking there about abortion on demand. She continues, 75 years ago, Margaret Sanger founded Planned Parenthood to liberate individuals from the mighty engines of repression. As she wrote, the men and women of America are demanding that they be allowed to mold their lives not at the arbitrary command of church or state, but as their... And she closes. I'm proud to continue that struggle to defend the rights of all people to their own beliefs. When others try to inflict their views on me, my daughters, or anyone else, that's not morality. That's tyranny. It's unfair, and it's un-American. Close quote. Wow.
So, question, where was the metaethics in that? That sounded like a normative moral plea for tolerance. What does that have to do with whether moral facts are made true by stances? What does that have to do with whether the truth of moral claims are indexed to the standards of individuals or groups? Nothing. It's not a metaethical view. I'm going to take it back because I didn't hear a single metaethical view expressed.
I hope the tolerance and that fundamental but tempered... It means sharing a sense of moral responsibility. And we'll talk about that, and you might catch on to it as I read. So here I go. Waddton. Like most parents, I think that a sense of moral responsibility is one of the greatest gifts I can give my child. But
a sense of moral responsibility. So this has something to do with, like I said, this doesn't sound like if you hold someone morally responsible. It sounds like more like a type of responsibility of, what would be the best way of phrasing this? Like accountability, like holding yourself accountable. It's someone that is like, okay, I am going to be responsible for what I do. So it's that kind of accountability. It's not I'm holding that person responsible for what they did wrong, but it's a kind of preemptive sense that one needs to think through their actions and take responsibility for what one does themselves. Often the term moral responsibility and moral philosophy has to do with this kind of external sense of whether you are an appropriate subject of praise, blame, punishment, so on and so forth for your actions, given the agential features that you were in possession at the time of committing some potential transgression. So that's a different sense of responsibility. So already this is like a normative standard that this person is talking about. I didn't hear a whiff of metaethics there.
Teaching morality doesn't mean imposing my moral values on others. It means sharing wisdom, giving reasons for believing as I do, and then trusting others to think and judge for themselves.
Arguably, there could be a touch of metaethics in there, but mostly this sounds like a normative moral standard. I am not hearing metaethics here. And if there is metaethics in here, it's buried. It's not at all clear that it's there. And whatever is there is entangled heavily with normative moral standards. What I mean by that? So I've talked about what metaethics is. Normative ethics deals with the principles, standards, and guidelines that govern the broad conditions under which we make moral decisions. So it deals with the matter of like what it is that makes these first order, like what regiments and organizes our first order moral claims, such that they're like this is what makes things good, morally speaking. This is what makes things bad, morally speaking. And so your standard examples would be things like consequentialism, which holds that whether an action is right or wrong depends on the consequences it would have or the expected consequences it would have. The ontology says that what makes something right or wrong is its conformity with certain rules. There's certain sort of moral laws that you are to obey or duties that you are to have that are not fully dependent on their consequences. And you got virtue ethics that says, like the good thing to do is what a perfectly virtuous person would do under the circumstances. And so that focuses more on the cultivation of particular sorts of character traits like courage and integrity and honesty. And then good action follows from what a person that has, depending on the view, someone that has fully integrated all these virtues is going to have the competence to make the appropriate sort of judgment in the appropriate in the relevant circumstances. So you have these different sorts of approaches to normative ethics, and they deal with questions like, would it be wrong to steal? Would it be okay to lie here? If a position says you should lie or you should not harm that person, that's when you're dealing with those first order moral claims about what's good or bad, right or wrong. Metaethics doesn't tell you what's good or bad, right or wrong. It tells you what it would mean for something to be good or bad, right or wrong, or what would make it the case that things in principle could be good or bad or right or wrong, or how you would know whether something is good or bad or right or wrong. So it's dealing with that second order, more abstract questions. So when someone goes around saying, I want to instill moral responsibility, like a sense of moral responsibility in somebody, it sounds kind of virtue ethics-ish. It sounds like you're trying to get somebody to have a certain type of psychological change such that they have a disposition to act in a certain sort of way. And then it goes on to talk about various values that they want to instill in people. That's normative ethics. That's not metaethics.
My parents' morals were deeply rooted in religious conviction, but tempered by tolerance. There's our word.
Yeah. See, so you ought to be tolerant to people with different moral standards than you. It's a normative moral principle. It's a first order moral claim. It's not a second order moral claim. That's not metaethics.
The essence of which is respect for other people's views. They talk, and that fundamental respect for others is morality of the highest order.
You ought to be respectful of other people. Normative moral view. This is not metaethical relativism. So why are we reading this passage as though this is relevant to assessing whether the truth of moral claims is indexed to the standards of different individuals or groups, or whether moral facts are dependent on the standards of individuals or groups, like, or other stances, could be other stances.
I devoted my career to ensuring a world in which my daughter, Felicia, can inherit that legacy. I hope the tolerance and respect I show her as a parent is reinforced by the work she sees me doing every day, fighting for the right of all individuals to make their own moral decisions about childbearing. Of course, we're talking there about abortion.
The right of individuals. Yeah, like talking about rights, that's normative ethics. So we're seeing some deontological language here. We're seeing a little bit, maybe a touch of virtue ethical language. And more generally, we're just seeing normative moral language all through this.
On demand. She continues, 75 years ago, Margaret Sanger founded Planned Parenthood to liberate individuals from the mighty engines of repression.
Normative ethics.
As she wrote, the men and women of America are demanding that they be allowed to mold their lives not at the arbitrary command of church or state, but as their conscience and judgment may dictate. And she closes, I'm proud to continue that struggle to defend the rights of all people to their own beliefs. When others try to inflict their views on me, my daughters, or anyone else, that's not morality. That's tyranny. It's unfair, and it's un-American.
Yeah, so and I think he may point this out. You're going to see an obvious tension here, which is that anybody tries to impose this standard that you like. I'm going to fight for the right that's going to prohibit you from imposing your standards on me. Well, in doing that, you're imposing your standards on them, aren't you? And that does seem pretty in conflict to me. So that is a problem for somebody that has this normative view, like, you're going to be tolerant of everybody or else. So you have, this, I mean, it's kind of, I guess, related to the paradox of tolerance. But that's really an issue for like normative ethics. That's not an issue for metaethics. It's not metaethics.
Close quote. Wow. That's good writing. That's powerful. Sounds so sensible. It sounds so reasonable. Sounds so tolerant. But there's a flaw. Before I get to the flaw, though, let me ask you a question. If you followed her rationale, I want to know what her view of morality is. Is her view of it's actually a little bit confused in here, but what it sounds like, is this an ice cream view of morality, or is this an insulin view of morality? Ice cream, yeah. In other words, she says,
You see, what is he basing that on? It's not clear. It sounds like it's a normative moral view. What if you held a view like this? All people have an obligation to tolerate other people with different moral standards, and to respect them. That sounds like a normative claim, not a metaethical claim.
we should trust others to think and judge for themselves. They should be allowed to mold their lives as their conscience and their judgment may dictate. So Waddton here is relativistic. She's promoting a moral neutrality and non-interference. All right?
Yeah, so moral neutrality, not a metaethical position. Tolerance, not a metaethical position. So recall, like, if he's going to say moral relativism is this view that moral facts depend on your stances, where did this person say moral truth depends on your stances? Now, if you say everyone has a right to act on their own moral conscience, that's not saying that their claims are true relative to their stances or true dependent on their stances. It's not saying that. That would be something different. Now, they might function, they might sound similar and seem like they would function the same way, but this person could think, no, it's a stance-independent moral fact that all people should tolerate everybody else's moral standards.
However, what's the flaw? She says if we're not neutral, we're not tolerant. What's the flaw here? Here's the flaw. Faye Waddleton's not neutral.
Now, here, he's saying this is a stance of moral neutrality, but I don't know that the person actually said that they're neutral.
Does she have the same morally neutral, non-interfering respect for views that differ from hers? Well, let's look at what she says. She says that we should, and by the way, when you hear the word should, it's almost always referring to a moral rule that's being applied to other people. We should respect another's point of view. She wants to continue the struggle to defend the rights of all people to their own beliefs. And then she has this to say of those whose beliefs on morality are different than hers. They're unfair, they're un-American, and they're tyrannous. You realize those are all moral judgments that she's making on people who don't agree with her, okay?
So you don't necessarily have to have an issue here. So you could hold a view, and you might consider it kind of ad hoc, but you could hold the view that we should tolerate everybody's moral standards other than people that have intolerant moral standards. And the only moral standards we should impose on people is the right for everybody to otherwise decide for themselves, aside from the fact that we all have an obligation not to impose our moral standards on one another. Now, that might seem like you're carving out special provisions for some of the rules over the others, and that's because you are. But that's not necessarily inconsistent. It just seems kind of arbitrary. You could just have a view like that. That's not necessarily inconsistent, but you just could. Now, it's potentially inconsistent if you think something like you must tolerate everybody and you should not tolerate people that are against tolerance. Then you have an inconsistency. But often people, I think, are too quick to infer an inconsistency when a set of like special or arbitrary exceptions might be consistent with the person holding the position without there really being an inconsistency. Yeah, this is a good point too. So Mind Onion says calling them unfair, tyrannous, and un-American doesn't say we should ban those views or not tolerate those views. That's true. So someone can say, look, I think your views are bad. I'm willing to argue with you, but I'm not going to try to stop you from expressing the view. Now, there might be an issue of whether they would try to physically stop the person from doing something they considered unfair or tyrannous. But simply trying to argue and persuade isn't necessarily imposition. Unless it's like an imposition to try to, like, if you ask somebody for $1, are you imposing your preferences on them? They could just say no. And if you're like, oh, well, but please, I really need it. And if they're like, no, okay, well, then you're not imposing anything on them. You asked. Now, there are contexts where repeatedly asking or being pushy or something could be exerting social pressure, shaming. There are ways of that turning into pressure. But the mere fact that you describe them this way doesn't necessarily entail some kind of imposition. Or if it is imposition, it's of such a mild form, a person could finesse that too and just say, look, imposition up to a certain, past a certain threshold is what we really are objecting to. But my main concern here is just that it's not clear to me that what he's describing is any sort of metaethical position.
Here's another curiosity. The first sentence, like most parents, I think that a sense of moral responsibility is one of the greatest gifts I can give my child. And then she goes on to say, this is what she teaches Felicia, her daughter. Now, I just wonder, does she have bedtimes for her kids? Does she make them do their homework? Does she teach them that they ought to respect other people's points of view? What is she doing? As a good parent, she's investing objective moral principles.
Nope, that's not true. He did not show that they think that the principles that they're teaching their children are objective. So this is a very common thing, and I find this pretty objectionable. That when a person tries to teach a moral standard or defend a moral standard, someone will say, "See, so they're treating it as objective." No, they're not. Acting on your moral standards doesn't entail that you take them to be objective. Where did he get that from? Notice at no point has he made any, like, where is this inference coming from? What is it based on? So this person is teaching certain sorts of values to their children. Therefore, they're objective. I mean, look at what he says here.
Does she teach them that they ought to respect other people's points of view? What is she doing? As a good parent, she's investing objective moral principles into the life of her daughter. So
where is that coming from? Why did he put scare quotes around it with his fingers? Air quotes, scare quotes, air scare quotes. I don't know what they're called.
But there's an internal contradiction that's going on at every.
Yeah, I'm not seeing a contradiction there. Teaching your children moral values that you think are good isn't teaching them that they're objective and then denying their objective. First, this person did not in any clear way deny moral objectivity. And even if they do reject moral objectivity, teaching the children their values doesn't presuppose it implicitly that they're committed to some type of moral objectivity. This is weak sauce, you know? So he does a pretty good job explaining what all the metaethical distinctions are. And he has this quote that has nothing, as far as I could tell, to do with metaethics. Then he's interpreting and making all sorts of inferences about what this person thinks without demonstrating it. The quote he provided gave no clear demonstration of what this person's metaethical views are. Then then he says this person's endorsing relativism, and then they're contradicting themselves by being an objectivist in this particular case. He hasn't shown any of that. They've said nothing explicitly that would support anything that he's attributing to this person. He's taking a quote that is completely unclear with respect to where they stand on metaethical issues. He appears to be projecting metaethical positions onto them in a way that seems entirely baseless, and then criticizing them for the contradictions in their view, which are totally made up. This person hasn't said anything contradictory. Now, there might be tensions in this person's views, but you would need better support than the kind of quote he provided.
Every level of this piece. And not only will she impose her view on her child, she will impose her own moral view on you. How do I know that? Because that's what she said. I've devoted my life to ensuring a world in my legacy. What legacy? Her point of view.
So trying to ensure your point of view doesn't require imposition. You could try persuading people or arguing with people. That's not an imposition, at least not in any plausible use of the term. So if someone goes around saying, look, I want to ensure we live in a world where everybody's tolerant of one another, it'd be weird to go, you're imposing it. If there was, no, I want to persuade you to be tolerant. I'm not going to force you to be tolerant. I'm going to persuade you. So, it's easy to say, like, look, it would be intention if someone said you should never impose your standards on anybody, and I'm going to go around and impose the standard on everybody that you should never impose your standards on anybody. That would be a contradiction. But if you're going to accuse somebody of a contradiction or a tension, again, they might be in this person's views. It wouldn't surprise me. A few things, though. One is that's a tension in their normative moral standards. You shouldn't impose your standards on anybody, and you should impose the standard that you shouldn't impose your standards on anybody. Those are normative moral positions. That has nothing to do with metaethics. Second, just because that person has contradictory beliefs does not mean that you've shown any problem with metaethical relativism or relativism in general. So the fact that you can identify a person that has confused or contradictory views doesn't mean that you've shown the position itself entails confused or contradictory views. If I find a Christian that has contradictory views, does that mean Christianity is false? Well, doesn't it depend on the views? If the views are some sort of if Christianity was both committed to the resurrection of Jesus and the non-resurrection of Jesus, yeah, that's a problem for Christianity. But if I find a Christian that both says, there's compelling evidence that the universe is only 6,000 years old, and they accept evidence that the universe is much older than that, maybe that's a problem. But then that would show that that Christian is confused or has a contradictory view on the age of the earth. Does that show Christianity is false? Absolutely not. So finding a person that might be a moral relativist and that might have some tensions in their normative standards, and then using that to say, like, what? That relativism is wrong? It doesn't follow that relativism is wrong. And he doesn't even fail. He doesn't even succeed at the very low bar of showing this person has the problems he's attributing to them. So this is not convincing at all.
And how does she ensure that? She's a lobbyist, for goodness sake. She's not far from us right now. Well, this is where she used to work. I don't know what she's doing now. Capitol Hill, lobbying senators, congressmen, so that they will pass laws that force you to live consistently with her moral point of view.
So that's a better argument here. So if they're passing laws that actually restrain, constrain, or influence other people's actions and it like against those people's will, that is a type of imposition. And so if the idea is you shouldn't impose people's standards on others, and then they're going to go and impose their standards on others, there's a tension there. But again, this in no way impugns metaethics. This in no way impugns metaethical relativism, I should say specifically.
Now, with your own. Case in point, a while back, Congress passed a law making it a federal offense to block an abortion clinic. And I was driving in the Los Angeles area on the way to an event when I listened to the news, and I had heard Pamela Moraldo, who followed Faye Waddton as president.
I'm not seeing a huge problem here with someone. If a person held a view like this, look, everybody has a right to act on their own moral conscience. And so like there is a universal moral rule that you can't impose your standards on other people, and we're going to enforce that rule. We're going to impose that standard on everybody. As long as you just specify there are some rules that you impose on other people, and those are the rules it's necessary to impose on people in order to prohibit people to the maximum extent possible from imposing other, like any specific rules on people, aside from the rule to impose rules on people. So is it kind of arbitrary? Yeah, but it's not contradictory if you think that. Unfortunately, I don't know what the people that say these sorts of things think about these sorts of things. If they went around saying that there are no universal moral rules except this one, or you shouldn't impose your moral standards on anybody except for the rule that you shouldn't impose your moral standards on anybody, we're going to enforce that, then what's the problem? So now you can no longer accuse the view of being internally contradictory. I doubt if a person said that, like imagine this person somewhere in their writing said, look, there's a small set of rules I am okay with imposing on other people, which are any rules necessary to ensure that aside from this set of rules, like these meta rules, call these meta rules, you can't otherwise impose your moral rules, your moral values or beliefs on anybody. So the only rules you're allowed to impose are the rules that prohibit people from imposing other rules. Okay. And then the rest of the rules you can't impose. Now, let's say a person explicitly said that. So they don't have a contradictory position. They have this kind of, it seems a little unprincipled, a little arbitrary. Would Christians or this man or other people just go, oh, well, you have a consistent position, so now, I guess I don't have no objection. I don't think they would be okay with that. I think that they are opposed to, they wouldn't just go, oh, well, now I can't think of anything for why that's a problem. So I don't think this is like, aside from it appearing to potentially be internally contradictory, that some of the views some people have, if you get around that, would they accept them? Probably not. So then what's the next reason? Why are we going to object to them then? Adam says, have you ever noticed or found any explanation for why, whenever I talk to people about moral relativism, specifically appraiser relativism, they almost always conflate it with cultural relativism? Well, I haven't encountered that. Yeah, I haven't encountered that. Like people specifically conflating. Are you saying people specifically conflate appraiser relativism with cultural relativism, or just relativism in general with cultural relativism? The conversation inevitably veers off into something like, so if a culture says X is okay, then your view means you think it's okay too. Yeah, I take it back. I've seen that sort of thing. Yeah, I don't know why people do that. I don't know why. It could be that people are just imitating the common objections, like, oh, well, what if there was a society that thinks this, as if I think moral facts are determined by like social consensus or something. I don't think that. Why would I think that? So yeah, I don't know. It's probably a bit of imitation. It's a good question though. Yeah, and it's similar to Mind Onion's response. Adam, well, I can explain it. People are explicitly taught to respond this way. Heck, I was taught to respond this way. Yeah, so I think this is, people are like, there are, it's almost like people use them like use responses like Pokemon cards. Like there's like a canned set. I call these canned arguments and canned responses. And so people just, it's like a mimetic thing. People learn canned responses and they give the canned responses. And when you have just a set of canned responses, because you can't really think through things for yourself and respond adaptively to what a person's actually saying, often the canned responses are somewhat inappropriate to the context. Yeah, Adam says trap activated. Exactly. It's like that. And this is why you get stuff like people saying that's a you're mixing up metaphysics and epistemology, or mixing up ontology and epistemology. You know, people love to say that. Often it's totally inappropriate in the context in which they're saying it. The person's not mixing anything up. So people just throw that out because it sounds fancy. You know, the moment you start saying epistemology, people are like, whoa, you're smart. You said a big word. So people will do that. What else do people do? The fallacy. Oh, that's question begging. That's post hoc ergo propter hoc. People will throw fallacy names at you all the time when they don't apply. That's a category error, and it's just not a category error, and that doesn't even make sense in the context. You know, I've had people say I'm begging the question when they'll say, "What's your view?" And I'll say, "I think this," and they're like, "You're begging the question," and I'm like, "I'm not making an argument. I can't be begging a question. What the hell are you talking about?" I mean, I've had I think multiple times now had to try carefully to explain why making a claim is not begging a question, because question begging is a feature of arguments, not claims. So if I just tell you I don't believe in God, that's question begging. No, it's not. That doesn't make any damn sense. So, but people just internalize and habituate the use of these trap card type things, and they just use them. Like it's almost like they think they're gonna Kamehameha you or something. Like they're gonna learn moves from a video game or anime or something and then use them. Like, there's the move that you use. It's nonsense. A lot of people are just not very good at thinking through these things, and so they accumulate this amalgamation of canned and preset responses and lines and things to say, and they just don't. They don't. It's like very surface level. It's very. I could say more disparaging things, but I won't.
Of Planned Parenthood, and she responded regarding that law with this statement: "This law goes to show that no one can force their viewpoint on someone else." You all chuckle because
that's pretty funny. This law goes to show nobody can force their viewpoint on everybody. So we're going to have a law. We're going to enforce the law. We're going to enforce the viewpoint on people that you can't enforce your viewpoint on people. It does sound superficially pretty contradictory and nonsensical.
As you see the obvious contradiction, all laws force a viewpoint. That's the point of laws. Now, just a clarification. Do I object to Faye Waddton, Pamela Moraldo, or anyone inveighing as they're able to on Congress to pass laws that reflect their moral viewpoint? No, of course not. That's the American way. Everybody gets a voice. Everybody gets a vote. Once in a while, some people get two. But the point is, we get to do what we can in our culture to have our moral viewpoint expressed in law. Nothing wrong with that. My point is very simple. It's not neutral. Faye Waddton speaks relativism, but she's not a relativist. She sounds like she's tolerant, but she's willing to force her view on other people. I just want you to get that. That's the myth of moral neutrality. And by the way, if tolerance is, in a sense, the virtue of moral relativism, can't we all just get along? You have your views, I have mine, and we tolerate each other. Then if tolerance is based on neutrality, and there is no neutrality, then tolerance is a myth as well, at least the way it's communicated in this environment.
Mind Onyon says laws don't force viewpoints. I mean, we don't have thought crime. Yeah, I don't think that's what he means. I don't think he means that they're forcing you to think a certain way. It's that they are imposing their standards on you in terms of your conduct or action. So if somebody like bans speeding in a car, it's not that you're like literally unable to think it's okay to speed in a car. They're like imposing a punishment if you get caught doing so. Be the same thing here. So if you tried to block an abortion clinic, the police get called, they'd remove you. But they're not actually enforcing you thinking that you should do that. So I don't think that's a big problem with what he said.
For example. And here I'm going to give you, I'll show you how this kind of works a little bit, but also give you a tool that will help you deal with the issue. This is a tactical maneuver, and it's going to use some questions. I wrote a book called Tactics, a game plan for discussing your religious convictions. And I've found that the best way to engage productively in a hostile environment is to use questions. I call it the Columbo tactic. Lieutenant Columbo, some of you gray heads out there might remember who this guy is, but he would just kind of enter a conversation.
I know who Columbo is. And then I was going to say, but I'm not a gray hair. But then wait a minute. I am. Damn. Yeah. So someone says the contradiction around the meta rule of openness, neutrality, not really a problem. The imposition of it is what allows disagreement in the first place. It imposes the least on someone. Right. It's only a contradiction if the person is genuinely committed to something like you should never impose any standard of any kind on anybody, regardless of what it is. And you should impose the standard on people that they have to abide by this rule. So if you have a position where it's just straight up, you should never impose X on people and you should impose X on people, you've got a contradiction. But a person that is in favor of enforcing rules in favor of tolerating viewpoints on others, they could just make an exception. And that's just not a problem. And I remember seeing objections like, oh, so what are you going to do? Just make a special rule that says you can't impose any standards on anybody other than this one? Yeah, you could just do that. What's the problem? You just can. Mind Onion says, I know who Columbo is and I'm not gray haired yet. Well, I am. And what makes me sad is I was going to say, I know who Columbo is and I'm not gray haired yet, but I am. So, I went gray in my 30s. So that should tell you something about what a dissertation does to you. Oof. Yeah, I went gray haired. I went gray haired like on my face, not up here. I got nothing here.
Kind of casually and ask a lot of questions. He's a detective and he's trying to solve the crime, but he comes in under the radar. Okay. So this is a way you can do it. But one of the ways we use tactics, questions, is to gather some information, but that also helps us to exploit and reveal a weakness or a flaw in the approach. And you'll see that here. Now we're talking about tolerance. So somebody's going to, because of the things I believe and the way I talk about them, both moral and spiritual, I'm going to be accused of intolerance. This happened lots of times. You're intolerant. When anybody ever calls you a name, always ask for a definition. Whether they call you a homophobe or Islamophobe or a bigot or whatever it happens to be, just ask them what they mean by that. And so if somebody says you're intolerant, I'm going to ask them, what do you mean I'm intolerant? Why would you say that about me? Well, you think you're right and everyone else is wrong. Okay, notice that's the violation of tolerance, right? I'm the right one, everybody else is wrong. Let me ask you a question.
Here would be my question. What's this have to do with metaethics? So, I mean, he's describing interactions of people that are making bad objections to views. Well, maybe they're good objections to views, but then following them up with bad claims. So if someone says, hey, you're a bigot in this or that way, and the person is a bigot in this or that way, well, good for them to call someone out for that. But if they follow that up with this, like, whatever it is he just said, what is it that he said?
Why would you say that about over Islamophobe or a bigot or whatever it happens to be? Just ask them what they mean by that. And so if somebody says you're intolerant, I'm going to ask them, what do you mean I'm intolerant? Why would you say that about me? Well, you think you're right and everyone else is wrong. Okay.
See, that's different from saying that someone's intolerant. You think you're right and everyone else is wrong. That would be a silly thing to say, because obviously everybody thinks they're right and everybody else is wrong. Unless they're relativist about the truth on the matter in question. Thinking that you're right and other people are wrong doesn't entail intolerance. So that would be a silly thing for a person to say. But again, it sounds like he's describing like your everyday folk relativist. And so what if that person is wrong? That doesn't like follow some trail back to metaethical relativism as a position and show there's a problem with a position. It shows that person is not a very clear thinker and isn't raising good objections. So So if I run into a Christian apologist on the street and they do a bad job, Christianity's false. Nope.
Notice that's the violation of tolerance, right? I'm the right one, everybody else is wrong. Let me ask you a question. Do you think that when I think I'm right, do you think that when I give an opinion about something, do you think that I think I'm right? Of course. Nobody gives an opinion about something if they don't think their opinion is true, right? Everybody believes their beliefs are true. Now, everybody doesn't know their beliefs are true. That's a different level. But they think they are. That's why we believe what we believe. If we didn't believe our beliefs were true, we wouldn't believe them. We believe something else and think that we're true. Okay, with me on that? Which means Mr. Koukl is not the only one in this conversation that thinks he's right. It's just Mr. Koukl is the only one who's getting called a name, whose character is in question for thinking he's right. So now you see that, and I see that, and I realize that. So I could just point that out to him. That would be accurate, but inelegant. So instead, I'm going to do what? What do you think I'm going to do? Ask a question, exactly. I ask him, what does he mean by intolerant? And he gives me the definition. You think you're right. Well, I could tell him I do think I'm right, but I mean, I could be wrong, and I'm totally open to that and talking about it, okay? Except for with my kids. But I ask him, what about your own views? Do you think you're right? What's he going to say? No, I think all my views are wrong. Of course he thinks he's right. Now, sometimes they'll do the little postmodern two-step and they'll say, well, I think my views are true for me. Well, if they're just true for you, then why are you talking to me right now? Sounds like you're trying to correct me. You want me to believe like you, which is the tolerant kind. No, they think they're right. Don't let them get away with that. Okay. Then I have a final question. Why is it when I think I'm right, I'm intolerant, but when you think you're right, you're just right? What am I missing?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you are missing something. So let's say a person said, I really don't like people that are bigoted or dislike people because of the way that they are. And I'm going to go around and I'm going to criticize those people and I want to stop those people. Now, you encounter a person and let's say the person is like super mega racist or they're super mega sexist, or I don't know, they have like some weird view that they don't like anybody named Lance and they think everybody named Lance is an idiot. And you say, okay, that's bad. You shouldn't be that way. And they say, whoa, 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 whoa. I thought you're in favor of tolerance. So here we get to this paradox of tolerance thing. Who are you to judge me? I thought you're for tolerance. Okay, so if you're in favor of tolerance, does that mean that you must tolerate intolerance? Well, you wouldn't be able to consistently do so if you think you must tolerate all positions, all attitudes, all dispositions, all people, regardless of the content of the attitude or the disposition or the whatever it is, because that would require you to tolerate intolerant people. Well, I guess you could just tolerate intolerant people. But if you then acted to oppose them or object, then you would be engaged in a performative contradiction. And if you said you must tolerate everybody and you should not tolerate intolerant people, then you would have like an actual like principled commitment to a contradiction. So it's possible for a person to be committed to a contradiction. It's possible for a person to engage in a performative contradiction, but it's not required of somebody that's pro-tolerance. For a person to be pro-tolerance, I don't see a problem for that person to say, I am against all forms of bigotry or intolerance, but there's one group that I don't tolerate, which is bigots and intolerant people. Is that really a problem? I don't think so. I don't see what the issue is supposed to be with that. And so this person could say, well, the problem with this view for being intolerant is that, like, in virtue of some characteristic that a person has or something like that, you're going to deny the person a right or imprison them or punish them or judge them or harm them or do something to them in some way. And if you say, look, I'm going to act on the rule that anybody that tries to do that to other people, I'm going to stop them. I'm intolerant of intolerance. That you could call that a kind of like meta intolerance. And I don't really think it impinges on or interferes too much in practice with one's pro-tolerance stance. So I don't really see a problem here. I do think there's not really a big problem with the kind of state of mind he's describing. Again, you could point out, like, technically a person could be committed to some sort of views that are in tension, or they could act in a way that's in tension with what their explicitly stated values or commitments are, but in a way that I think is entirely understandable and isn't really a big problem.
Now it's their turn to talk, right? The ball's in their court. And what are they going to say? As God is my witness, 2 times I've had people, when I've asked them, why is it when I think I'm right, I'm intolerant. When you think you're right, you're just right. And they've said to me, because I'm actually right. What's going on here is just raw name calling. They have changed the subject. We're talking about an issue.
Okay, I can't help myself. It's a little ironic. He's accusing this imaginary person he's criticizing for changing the subject when he's changed the subject. At the 15-minute mark, when I started this video, we were talking about metaethical relativism. And not once am I seeing any criticism of metaethical relativism here. He's criticizing people that have like weird views about tolerance. What the hell does that have to do with relativism as a metaethical view? Not much. Now, if you were criticizing agent relativism, this wouldn't even be the best way to go about doing it. He's discussing either anecdotal, maybe there's some truth to it, maybe these are hypothetical people, maybe these are helpful fictions for illustrative purposes, not necessarily anything wrong with that. But whatever it is he's criticizing, it's not the position that he initially characterized in the first 15 minutes of the video. He's criticizing some type of what sounds like folk relativism, and it's not a metaethical view. And I know I've repeated that a bunch of times, so I'm just going to stop repeating that.
And they go and call me a name. So we move from the issue to the name calling, right?
Right. So, like, look what Adam says. And who is the straw man he's fighting? No moral anti-realist I know calls someone intolerant for expressing their views. Right. I don't do that. Now, is it likely that he's encountered people that do this? Absolutely. I completely believe the kind of conversations he's reporting having are quite accurate because I've had these conversations with people. But in any case, I don't see any particular reason, given what I know about people and the way they talk and the way they think. And, given that I do study the psychology of metaethics, this is not a surprising or implausible storytelling. Yeah. So he's running into people like this. Okay. What's that got to do with metaethical relativism?
They've changed the subject. Sometimes I'll ask them, why'd you change the subject? Huh? What do you mean? Well, we were talking about this, and now we're talking about my character. This actually happened on a TV show. Now, I'll talk about the whole show and what took place there at my own breakout coming later this afternoon, which is just a subtle advertisement for my session. Okay? But they're doing exactly the same thing that I'm doing, but I'm getting called a name. They've changed the topic. What if I would respond to them when he said to me, well, you're intolerant, and I said, well, you're ugly. And your mom dresses you funny. I wouldn't say that, right? Why not? Because it's rude.
So when he's saying they're changing the subject from what? What was the initial subject?
And it's irrelevant. Can ugly people be right once in a while? Don't you hope so, right? Okay, so it has nothing to do with whether you're right or wrong. And that's what I want.
So I guess the dispute is about whether somebody is right or wrong about some moral issue. So it could be that people are coming into things sounding like they're expressing some type of metaethical relativism. And then if he expresses disagreement with him, they start insulting him and calling him intolerant or a bigot or something. And that'd be stupid. They shouldn't do that. And it would be reasonable for him to object to that. But it'd be the same thing, if I start talking about Christians and I say, I don't think Christianity is true. And the person goes, you're an evil sinner and you suck and I hate you. Okay, well, I could tell a story about that and say, well, look at that. All they did was resort to insulting me. You know what question I'm going to ask? Does that have anything to do with whether Christianity is true? No. So it sounds like the same sort of thing here. JP says, I think what he's implying is that metaethical relativism doesn't practically exist because those who identify as relativists aren't as permissive in practice as their metaethics would demand. Yeah, I think he might even say something like this later in the video. I watched it at some point, at least most of the video. He might be saying something like that. But then there's the question, what type of relativism are we talking about? A few things you could say about this. If we're talking about appraiser relativism, it doesn't follow that you have to tolerate other people. If you're an agent relativist, then this is a weird way to go about objecting to it. And also, technically, if a person is an agent relativist, they could just be failing to live up to their own normative moral standards. So that you could just say, well, then the person is being morally bad by their own lights. It doesn't show that the position is wrong. It would just show that the person is like a massive hypocrite. So showing that people are massive hypocrites doesn't show that their views are false. So if I went around finding a bunch of Christians sinning, does that show Christianity is not true? No, it does not. So you could say it's evidence that the person isn't sincerely committed to their view. Okay, then when I see Christians that are acting inconsistent with what I believe Christians should be doing or what Christians in fact should be doing, is that evidence that they're not Christians. Maybe. I don't know if Christians want to go that route. But again, what would this show? What it would show is that in practice, like even if we say that is good evidence that the people are not really committed to relativism, what does that show? Well, at best, what that would show is lots of people that claim to be, from the sound of it, some type of agent relativist are not genuinely committed to that because they're engaged in performative contradictions. Okay. And so what does that show? Well, it might tell us something about human psychology, that it's difficult for people to remain committed to agent relativism. One, that does not show agent relativism is false. But two, even if we showed agent relativism was false, that doesn't show that appraiser relativism is false. So, and if you're going to make an argument like this, why not be more explicit about it? Why the roundabout stuff? Why, take over, 30, 40 minutes just to get to the damn point? So rhetorically, I don't think this is particularly effective. It's not super clear what the move is. It's not super clear what position he's targeting. This is a very roundabout way of going after relativism.
People to see. I'm not trying to one-up them. I'm not trying to gotcha. I'm just trying to help them to see, look, we're wasting our time here calling each other names. Why don't we spend our time doing the important thing, that's talking about the issue itself? But I want you to see that in this example, it shows that there is no neutral ground.
JPW says, are you really confused as to why you would take this tack? What do you mean? When you say, are you really confused? Like I'm sitting here, why would he do this? No, I'm saying this isn't from a normative standard, a good approach. If you're, what do I mean by that? I mean, if your goal is to offer a good criticism of metaethical relativism, this is not a good approach to doing so. If your goal is something other than that, then that would be fine. Now, I want to believe that he has good intentions and isn't like strategically trying to convince people of things independent of whether or not being malicious. I don't think he's being malicious. So I think he is making errors here strategically. Now, why would you bury the lead on the matter? I don't know exactly, because there might be reasons why he's doing things this way, but I do think if he wanted to raise good criticisms against the view, there are better ways to do it than how he's doing it. Now, I mean better from a normative standpoint, not necessarily from a what's the most convincing way standpoint, but even there, I think that you could make these criticisms a lot more straightforwardly. So I don't know what you're talking. I don't know exactly what you mean when you say, are you confused? I'm not confused. I'll also say it's a little weird when people use that term. I don't think that they mean anything bad by it, but confused would show that, like, I don't know. I don't know exactly what you mean by that. So you're asking me, are you really confused? And then you ask me, you literally just said, why would he do this? I'm going to ask you a question. Do you understand subtext? Do you understand like pragmatics? Do you understand rhetorical questions? If you're going to be sensitive to language, can you not understand why I would, like, if you're going to say, well, you can't understand why you would say that. Can you understand why I would say that? Like, just apply the standard consistently here. Just because I'm saying something like that doesn't mean that I'm baffled or befuddled. It's a kind of normative evaluation of what the person is doing.
Everybody who has an opinion about anything is taking a side, even in morality. I'll give you a kind of a little bit of an outdated example, but it doesn't make the point well. When my younger brother was raised his kid.
And while we're at it, one thing I could say is, why do you think he's approaching things in this way? Do you think this is like a super well thought out and very careful examination of the problems with metaethical relativism? Because if to be honest, I don't think this is a good critique of metaethical relativism. I think it's unclear what he's critiquing.
It's in Hawaii. He lived there for like 20.
And we could look at a few other things. Like, I think what he's implying is that metaethical relativism doesn't practically exist because those who identify as relativists aren't as permissive in practice as their metaethics would demand. So there's a few things about that. One, they're not as permissive in practice as their metaethics demand. If that's what he's getting at, I'm not sure that that's true. So if all a person wants to do is impose rules against imposing your views on other people, that might be like a technical contradiction if the person had certain sorts of commitments that they're inconsistent with that. But in practice, that's not a particularly intolerant stance. If like a person just went around trying to stop racists or bigots, is that a person like super bigoted for stopping all the bigots? No, they're not. And it would be like a weird pedantic intellectual point to say that they're like technically in being an anti-bigot activist, you're a bigot because technically you're against a group of people. Like you could try to make that point. It's not a very good point. He hasn't been clear on the agent appraiser distinction. He hasn't been clear on whether he's targeting a meta-ethical position or not. So if this is what he's getting at, and it very well might be, again, strategically, I'm not sure this is a good approach. And even if it's a good approach for that goal, it's unclear what the goal is because it's kind of muddled. But even if we make some inferences about what we take his goal to be, it looks like he's not really clearly targeting moral metaethical relativism. So there's like a layer cake of, I think, legitimate objections that I have here. Yeah. So I don't really see a problem with the objections I'm raising.
Years or something in Maui, and his kids went to school and they were being taught values clarification. You remember that stuff?
I don't know what he's talking about here because I got distracted by the chat. But by the way, JPW, I know I'm pushing back against what you're saying, but I should say I really appreciate someone pushing back against me in the chat. So sometimes people correct me in the chat, sometimes they push back on me, and it gives me something to do other than just review the video. So I do appreciate you arguing with me a bit. And JP says something else. Looks like it's directed at somebody else. I think it's possible, indeed common, to take an unconsidered or poorly articulate view that doesn't give you the practical wiggle room to actually behave consistently with that definition. Yeah, so do I. So, this is something I talked about Derek Callister about. Like, yeah, I think a lot of people with like these folk relativist views have muddled and potentially incoherent views. I just don't really think that that has much to do with exposing problems with like the philosophical view. And that really seems to be the common, underlying theme in what I'm objecting to here, which is one, I think just at the ground level, I think he might just be failing to raise strong objections to the views in question. Like that quote he read off, it's not even clear to me that the person is a relativist. So maybe he knows something I don't know, that they are a relativist, but it wasn't clear from their remark that they were. And then when he said, oh, well, this is an objective value, when he was describing them teaching their kids their values, he didn't do anything to support that claim. So like at the ground level, I think he's raising bad objections here, bad support, bad objections, that sort of thing. But even if the objections were successful, it just wouldn't have any particularly worrisome implications for somebody that's a meta-ethical relativist that holds a sort of conventional philosophical view, because most of his objections aren't really touching on the philosophical view. They're touching on the muddled and confused views of random people that he's met. And that's not a very helpful way of trying to understand whether the view is incorrect. Now, if you want to show that lots of people with views opposed to your own are confused and muddled, that's fine. But I do think it would be better to be more explicit about that.
Call this a course anymore class. This is the area for like even in morality. I'll give you a kind of a little bit of an outdated example, but it doesn't make the point well. When my younger brother was raised his kids in Hawaii, he lived for like 20 years or something in Maui, and his kids went to school and they were being taught values clarification. You remember that stuff? They don't call this a course anymore class. This is the air they breathe now. Values clarification was an exercise in the public schools where kids get to clarify their own values about things. And the particular illustration that they used was there was a husband and wife, and the wife was sick and really in a lot of pain and misery. And the question was, can the husband take the wife's life to ease her suffering? Okay, now it's a very manipulative question. It's the kind of thing that's really difficult for adults to answer. Yet this is what the grade school kids had to answer. Okay. And of course, what they're trying to do with these hard, challenging ethical dilemmas is to try to give the impression that all moral choices are like this. They're just up in the air. And what the teacher said is, we are going to let you clarify your own values. I'm not going to tell you what the right answer is. That's up to you. My brother got really angry. He went and talked to the teacher. And the teacher was defensive. The teacher said, look I'm neutral. I'm not telling them what to believe. And my brother pointed out, when you give my children difficult ethical challenges like that, or any, and then you tell them with regards to the right and the wrong answer, it's up to you. That's not neutral.
I agree with him about this. Yeah, I don't think that's neutral. And it does sound like people are pushing this agenda of giving people challenging moral dilemmas where there's conflicting values at the same time. Like, would it be okay to lie under these circumstances in order to save lives or whatever? So you can create these moral conflicts. And then you can give people the impression that because there are these issues in morality that are difficult in practice to resolve, you have this sense of unease. Yeah, morality is like that. There's not really any fact of the matter. And so even so you should have the same position on genocide, or you should have the same position on someone torturing babies. That's insane and bad. And if people are doing that, of course, I have no way of readily confirming immediately whether people have actually done that. I mean, maybe there's some evidence people have taught people things this way. That would be bad. People shouldn't be teaching people to be ambivalent or uncertain about moral issues. I certainly would prefer, relative to my own moral standards, that people take a firm stance in opposition to baby torture or whatever the horrible thing is. There might be issues where I go, oh, I don't know. And then, I would be fine with people having that attitude about it. But when it comes to a lot of mundane moral transgressions, I don't want people to be taught that it's all up in the air and it's up to the individual. I don't want people to think it's up to the individual whether they to kill people or something. That would be horrible. So if people are conditional on this story being accurate, I would be opposed to that too. But again, that has nothing to do with metaethics. That has nothing to do with being a relativist. So that's like some weird, maybe an epistemological issue that all moral issues are irresolvable in practice. I'm not really sure what that view is, but it's not metaethical relativism. Yeah, I mean, Zictomorph is mocking this. LOL, don't make my kids think hard about moral questions. I don't think that's what he's objecting to. So let's try to be a little fair to him. I don't think he's saying you shouldn't get kids to think through difficult moral issues. I think he's accusing people of having an agenda where they're trying to give people difficult moral issues and then cause the children to generalize from the difficulty of those moral issues about which they may be uncertain or ambivalent, to being uncertain and ambivalent about moral issues in general, to give them the impression that the proper stance to take on all moral issues is that you should be neutral. So because you're uncertain in this case, you end up being agnostic, you should be agnostic or neutral on all moral issues. And then when they encounter torture and genocide, then they're like, well, you got to be neutral on that too. And that would be a bad thing to teach kids. That's what he's claiming. Now, conditional on him being correct that that's what the person's intentions were in teaching this, or even, we could set aside their intentions, whether that's a consequence. I think both of those would be bad, and I would be against that. But it's not metaethical relativism. So. Okay, JP, that's a lot. Okay, I'm actually not really pushing back against your views so much as your engagement with this guy, to your question about his motivations, whether I think he's being malicious. In short, yes, when you say, why is he talking about things other than metaethics when he says he's going to talk about metaethics, the answer is it's by design. He's not stupid. He's not confused. He's moving the goalposts, which, despite your saying, why is he doing this, you've actually gestured at. Yeah, this is something that I've talked about in the channel before, and I respect other people. Hey, I'm tolerant of people having a different perspective on me about this. I am reluctant to attribute malicious intent to people. I think it's very hard to know what people's intentions are. I think in a lot of contexts, people think that people have malicious intent, or they quote unquote know what they're doing when they don't know what they're doing, or they're not doing the thing. So I don't know what his intentions are. So we probably just disagree about that. And that's fine. We don't have to agree on that. I might have overcorrected in my opposition to people inferring negative intent to where I don't infer it even when I should. But I'm not seeing it here. All right. I think I might want to wrap up soon. So we'll see if there's a natural stopping point here.
That's moral relativism. By the way, do they do the same thing in math class? I know they do it nowadays, but
Wait,
then
what is moral relativism?
It's up to you. That's not neutral. That's moral relativism. By the way, do they do?
Yeah, it's up to you to decide what's morally right or wrong. Sounds like agent relativism, not appraiser relativism. I know I'm repeating a lot of the same points, but like he is not giving us a lot of new material to work with. So it's kind of getting tedious even for me. And I have like an endless endurance for this. And even I'm kind of like, all right, I'm making the same point 73 times.
Do the same thing in math class? I know they do it nowadays, but then, no, they don't do that anymore. They didn't do that then, rather. But morality is up to them. And as a result, many people today live in a moral contradiction. Because I mentioned yesterday, and I got this from Francis Schaeffer, and it's a tremendous help to me. If you see the tactics book, there's a tactic called Inside Out. And the basics for the tactic is that, as Francis Schaeffer says, we live in God's world as a matter of fact, and we are made in the image of God as a matter of fact. And that means there are things that are built into all of us that we cannot get away with. The last line in that chapter says we can run from God, but we can't run from ourselves. God has built something in there, and that one of the things is a little moral machine that's always running. This is why we can't keep from making moral assessments. Francis Schaeffer called it moral motions. It's part of the human nature that we have. Animals don't have this, okay? C.S. Lewis talked about the content of that. Every society, in no society is cowardice considered appropriate, for example. There does seem to be a...
Yeah, I mean, he's veering off into some claim about like human moral psychology or something. I mean, this might be interesting stuff to consider. I don't really think so, because I don't think God has written moral standards into our hearts or something. But if this is supposed to be relevant to metaethics, I'm not. He hasn't done the work to make it relevant yet. So we'll have to wait and see if he does something with that. But it might be something for the next video. I'm still looking to see if there's a stopping point here.
Standard in all society that's part of human nature. So even though people, as I mentioned earlier, might talk about relativism for themselves, they still are down deep moral realists, the objectivists, if you will.
Yeah. So here we have this claim. People might say they're relativists, but down deep they're moral objectivists or moral realists.
Okay. People, as I mentioned earlier, might talk about relativism for themselves. They still are down deep moral realists, the objectivists, if you will.
Notice he said moral realist, so he used one of the common terms. And it's also worth noting he equated objectivism with realism. I tend to do the same, but it's worth noting that it looks like he inadvertently slipped into using some of the technical language that's used in the field that he had not been using earlier, which I think is interesting. But it's also like here we have that standard empirical claim. So this is a claim, but you could call it crypto realism. So crypto and then a view would be the view that people like secretly hold a view, or hold a view without even necessarily realizing they hold a view. So if you say everyone's a crypto utilitarian, you're saying, look, whether people realize it or not, everybody really deep down is a utilitarian. And this would be the same thing, that everybody deep down is a realist, even if they say they're a relativist. That's an empirical claim. There is zero compelling psychological research that would support this view. There's not really any good theoretical basis for thinking this. This is a very bold and very bold empirical claim. It's both of those. And there's not any evidence to support this. This is conjectural. This is largely based off of what he takes to be inconsistencies in the anecdotes and experiences he's had talking to people. He probably has more of a basis for this because I think he has some background in philosophy, but it's still based on psychological inferences that we're making about people based on superficial outward aspects of what people say and do in response to certain sorts of inquiries or interactions. And this is a very flimsy basis for making claims about what people think. So I'm going to stop the video there, and we'll address the last couple comments, and then I'm going to head out. I got to go have dinner. I'm getting super hungry. All right. JP says, God, I hate the character limits on commenting on YouTube. Yeah, I wish I could give people permission myself to write longer comments if they want to. Totally agree. The negative intent assumption is too clearly jumped at, but there's a lot of analysis of the motivations of pro-apologetics, which might justify a tad less charitability from you. I don't know that I'm being especially, maybe I am being more charitable. And I don't necessarily disagree with that. It's not like and also I'm not like oblivious to like, okay, take if someone's an apologist. I take that person to have an agenda. They have a goal, and that's going to influence what they do. And what I will say about that, though, is that a person that is an apologist or has some other sort of agenda, they could be influenced by unconscious forces to do things in ways that from the outside appear like the person is doing something intentionally. So a very common one would just be, one of the most standard biases people have, motivated reasoning. So people are subject to wanting to confirm the beliefs they're already inclined or want to believe are true. And this can cause them to systematically misevaluate evidence. So they'll fail to spot flaws in arguments for their view. They'll be more likely to notice, pay attention to, and seek out problems with views opposed to their own. Now, is this because people are they like know they're doing this and they're trying to do it? Like, yeah, I want to show that I'm right, so I'm going to seek out problems in a biased way, and I know this. No, people do this whether they are consciously, whether they're aware of it or not. They will still do this even if they're actively trying not to do it. So even if a person's trying to be as virtuous epistemically as possible, they're still going to be biased in favor of views they're inclined to believe and against views that they're disinclined to believe. So a person can be doing as much as they possibly can above board psychologically and like consciously and still fail to reason in an unbiased way. And so when I see a person giving a talk or presenting a set of arguments where they're making mistakes that I feel like they should know better or something like that, I don't infer malicious intent or conscious intent to deceive or anything like that, because it's so easy for a person to do exactly like the unvirtuous thing or to make those mistakes in a completely sincere, authentic, intention, like unintentional way where they're not trying to do something bad at all. So how do you know which one they're doing? I mean, sometimes there is enough extraneous evidence that it would justify making that sort of inference, but people's capacity for rationalizing and bullshitting themselves is substantial. I do it. Everyone does it. This is not specific to Christian apologists. You don't think I have an agenda? You don't think I have a goal? I'm not part of some organization. I'm not trying to convert people to like a broad worldview, but I certainly, I mean, and in a certain sense, I am. I want people to be pragmatists. I want people to agree with me. I mean, the blog post I just wrote today is how there's a sense in which I want people to like the music I like. I want people to like the food I like. I want people to like the art I like. I'm like this. I think most people are like this. And I don't even think there's necessarily anything wrong with this. So, as far as, people doing something where you're inferring malicious intent, I think it's much harder than people appreciate. All right. JP says, to be clear, it's damn hard to be too angry at you for being committed to charitability. Hardly the most offensive vice in human behavior. But it's still a vice, right? You still take it to be a vice. That's okay. I can live with it. Adam says, think you're right. He's conflating agent relativism with the general sense of moral relativism, which is why you need to be specific with your criticism. Yeah. Okay. So thanks, everybody. I'm going to wrap it up there. I am so hungry. I'm going to have a quick closeout. So I'll just say this, comment on the video, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Go check out the original video for this. It's not something I said in the previous one, and I will finish reviewing this. It's got a little less than half of it left. And who knows, sometimes they like trail off and they just stop being about metaethics and there's not much, I don't know. I don't remember what's in the rest of this. I have all my links in the description to the video. If you want to see where I'm at, support me, check out my stuff, join my Discord community, check out my blog. I got a new post on there that I just put up today. It's a real short one. It's very accessible. It's not a bunch of technical mumbo jumbo. So you could go check that out. All kinds of stuff. Just follow the links. And if you want a big list of all the links, I got a link tree and that'll take you to all the links. So go check that out. You could also check the first thing in the description of the video is a link to the original video. If you leave a comment on there, be polite. Don't be a jerk. Don't be part of toxic, crappy YouTube, comments. It's always a cesspit. Don't contribute to that. And I don't want to be a part of that. And I don't want you to do that. And it's not good for you. You habituate yourself to being a jerk to people online, probably carries over into real life, even if a little bit. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know. I'm making a psychological hypothesis there. But yeah, people need to stop being big jerks online just because they're sitting behind a desk and nobody could, retaliate. So don't do that. Be polite, be nice, be critical if you're so inclined. But yeah, try to be cool and don't be a jerk. All right, everybody. With that, I will see you all later. I got a busy weekend, so you're probably not going to see me, but I got a couple things going on next week. And then next week I got a conference. So starting on Wednesday. So I am going to almost certainly not be around for like almost a week. I think I do have a video scheduled during that time though. So you'll see something there. So I got some stuff early in the week next week, and then I'll be gone for a little bit. Oh, right. And I do have the baby coming up very soon. And so I will be on hiatus for quite a while. We'll see how, I have no idea how things are going to shape up after that. First baby for me. So I don't, I haven't been through this before, so I don't know how busy I'm going to be, but I can guarantee you I'm going to be busy. I'm not going to be sitting here trying to stream when I have a baby to take care of. So when that happens, you're not going to see me for a while. I may post a video once in a while. I may pop in here. It's not like I'm going to have zero time, but it's not going to be like streaming 3-4 times a week. That will not happen. And it shouldn't happen. Like if I am doing that, you should all tell me to shut up and go spend time with my baby. So I will see you all later, and take care, everybody.